It was an ordinary evening on our street in Ibadan. The sun had almost disappeared, leaving streaks of orange and purple across the sky. Children were chasing a football between parked cars, and neighbors stood outside their gates, exchanging the kind of conversation that carries no urgency at all. It was the sort of evening peaceful enough that no one would have imagined a family was about to begin to fall apart. I used to think the biggest lies were the ones people told. I was wrong. Sometimes the biggest lies are the ones love convinces us to believe. My family lived inside one for 24 years. And the first crack didn't appear the day I learnt the truth. It appeared the day my father forgot himself. I wasn't there when it happened. I only heard it afterwards, pieced together from a neighbor's trembling account and my brother Femi's voice on the phone. But I have replayed it so many times in my mind that it feels like memory now. My father, Gabriel Adebayo, stood in the middle of our street with his car keys hanging loosely from one hand. He turned in slow circles, studying the houses around him as though he had never seen any of them before. His shirt was neatly tucked in, his shoes were polished, his wedding ring still caught the evening light. Everything about him looked exactly the way it always had, except his eyes. They searched every gate with quiet uncertainty. A neighbor watching her flowers noticed him first. She greeted him by name. He smiled politely and greeted her back. Then he hesitated, looked down at his keys in his hand, and asked with complete sincerity if she could help him find Gabriel Adebayo's house. She stared at him for a second, then laughed nervously. "But sir, you are Gabriel Adebayo." He looked at her, then at the street, then back at her again. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. For the first time, even though I wasn't standing there, I later understood exactly what she saw on his face. Fear. Not the fear of danger, the fear of not trusting your own mind.
My phone rang while I was at my desk in the newsroom. It was Femi. He never called me during work unless something had happened. The moment I answered, I knew. His voice was shaking. "Tommy, you need to come home. It's Dad. He doesn't know why he is." The newsroom around me disappeared. The keyboards, the ringing phones, the chatter, all of it became distant. "I will be there," I said. I don't remember grabbing my bag. I don't remember leaving my desk. I only remembered running. Until that evening, I thought forgetting was the biggest sad thing that could happen to a family. I had no idea forgetting was making room for something much worse. But to understand that evening, I have to take you back 3 days earlier, long before my father forgot his own name, long before I questioned everything I believed about my family. People always ask journalists how they know when a story is worth chasing. The truth is, the story usually decides that before we do, and mine began on an ordinary Thursday morning, or so I thought. I was 27 years old and permanently guilty of replacing proper meals with Coca-Cola and packs of Fab biscuits. My best friend Timmy never let me forget it. She dropped a small food flask on my desk with enough force to make my Coke wobble. I didn't even look up from my laptop. "I cooked," she announced. "I can see that," I replied. "So you eat?" "I'm almost done," I fired back. "You've been almost done since yesterday." She sighed dramatically and pulled a chair beside me. "You know, one day your stomach is going to resign from this friendship." I laughed. My stomach knows greatness takes sacrifice. "You have trauma," she said. And this time, she didn't smile when she said it. That was Timmy. We'd met in our first week at university. Our names always getting mixed up for attendance. We discovered we both wanted to tell stories that mattered. She chose broadcast journalism. I chose investigative reporting. Our names were similar. Our dreams were almost identical. Some friendships take years to grow. Ours happened before our first semester ended. She came from a family that had never really been a family. Her parents separated before she turned 10. Her father disappeared soon after. Her mother spent years just trying to survive, more than raising children. She used to joke that she envied how close my family was. She'd say, "If I had your house, I'd never leave." She always laughed after saying it. But every now and then, I caught the part of her that wasn't joking. My phone buzzed. "Mommy," I smiled before answering. "Hello, Mommy, my journalist. I hope you are calling to congratulate me for finally eating." There was a short silence. "Tommy, you're still coming on Saturday?" "Of course, I wouldn't miss my dad's birthday." She lowered her voice. "And I've already ironed the dress I bought for you." I frowned. "You ironed my dress? Why?" "You'll see." Something in the way she said it made me smile. She was never mysterious unless she was planning something. "Mommy, what are you planning?" "Nothing. I have to go." And the line died. I stared at the phone for a moment, then smiled to myself. If I had known what that Saturday was really waiting for, I would have asked one more question. Just one. Timmy leaned across my desk. "What did Auntie Bessie say?" "Apparently she's hiding something." She gasped dramatically. "Are they finally announcing that your father is actually a billionaire? If he is, he forgot to tell us. Maybe he's waiting till retirement. I'd settle for him buying me a new laptop." She grinned. "I'll settle for him adopting me." The joke hung in the air for a second longer than usual. Then she laughed it away. I laughed too. Neither of us knew how strangely those words would echo just a few days later. That evening, I left work earlier than usual. Steve had asked to meet me after work and he'd sounded usually nervous on the phone. I assumed he'd finally decided where we'd spend Christmas. I couldn't have been more wrong. Thank you for following the story so far. What do you think they're about to find out? Drop your prediction in the comments below and don't forget to like and subscribe so this story can reach more people. Now, let's continue.
I arrived at a quiet botanical garden just before sunset. The paths were almost empty. Golden light filtered through the tall trees, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. It was peaceful enough that time seemed to slow down. Steve was already there, hands in his pockets, trying very hard to look relaxed, and immediately forgot how to smile again. I knew something was happening the moment I saw him pacing. "You've drilled a hole into that path," I said. He looked up and smiled, then immediately forgot how to smile again. "I've been here 20 minutes. You came 20 minutes early. I came 40 minutes early." I laughed. "You must be planning to commit murder." "Worse," he said, then swallowed. "I've rehearsed this 6 times. "Only 6? 12. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. He looked at it, then back at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The evening seemed to hold its breath with us. He took one slow step towards me. I had this whole speech. I can't remember any of it now. Then he laughed softly at himself. "I blame you. You showed up." "So this is my fault?" "Entirely." He shook his head. Every time I imagined this moment, I thought I'd say something profound. "You can't steal." "I can't. Because every profound thing I had in my head disappeared the moment I saw you." I looked down, trying to hide the smile creeping across my face. Steve had that effect on people. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, he was steady. The kind of person whose presence felt like arriving home after a long day. He opened the small box. A simple solitaire ring caught the evening light. His voice was calm now. No rehearsed speeches, no performance, just honesty. "I've loved you for a long time, Tommy. I don't know what the future looks like. I don't know how many difficult days we'll have or how many times we'll annoy each other." "I already annoy you," I told him. "I know, and I'm prepared to continue." We both laughed. Then his expression softened. "But I know one thing. I want every version of my future to have you in it." He lowered himself onto one knee. "Tomi Adebayo." He stopped, chuckled. "I've always wanted to say that." "You already say it." "I know, but it feels more official." I wiped away a tear before I even realized it had fallen. "Will you marry me?" For a second, I forgot every word I had ever learned. I simply stared at him. Then I nodded once, twice. finally finding my voice. Yes, his shoulders dropped with relief. That's good. Good? I had no backup plan. I laughed through my tears as he slipped the ring gently onto my finger. It fit perfectly. Neither of us noticed an elderly couple walking past until the woman clapped quietly. Congratulations. We turned, embarrassed. The old man smiled. Take care of each other. We will, Steve answered. The couple continued their walk, hands intertwined after what looked like a lifetime together. I watched them disappear down the path. I want that, I said. Steve followed my gaze. So do I. Looking back now, I realized something. The happiest moments of our lives often happen without asking permission from the sadness waiting ahead. If they didn't, maybe we'd never allow ourselves to be happy at all. As we walked back to the car, Steve reached for my hand. I should warn you, he said. I spoke to your dad. I asked for his blessing. I stopped walking. You asked my father before asking me? I wanted to do it properly. So the two of you are kicking secrets? Apparently. I stared at him in mock disbelief. I'm offended. You'll recover, he said, smiling. A few weeks ago, actually. That's when I asked. And he didn't tell me. He made me promise. I narrowed my eyes. So that's why Mom sounded suspicious on the phone. Steve laughed. I may have accidentally involved your entire family. You ambushed me. I prefer the word coordinated. I sighed dramatically. I can't believe everybody knew except me. He squeezed my hand. I wanted Saturday to be special. Your mom is planning a surprise birthday dinner, and I was hoping we'd turn it into our engagement party too. I stopped walking again, this time because emotion caught me completely off guard. You planned all that? We planned all that. He looked almost shy saying it. I've never really had a family that celebrated moments together. He rarely spoke about his own family, so I listened closely. My parents loved me, but loving someone isn't always enough to keep a family together. When I was 21, my dad lost everything. The business failed, most of the people around us disappeared. He smiled sadly. I learned something that year. When people are hurting, some people leave. A gentle silence settled between us. I promised myself then, if I ever loved someone, I'd never become one of the people who walked away. I don't know what life will throw at us, but whatever it is, I'll still be standing there. You sound very sure. I am. How? Because I already made that decision before I met you. The breeze lifted a few loose strands of my hair and he tucked them behind my ear. Neither of us realized those words would soon be tested in ways we could never have imagined. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in the smell of jollof rice and the sound of my mother's voice already shouting instructions from the kitchen before I'd even stepped inside our family home. The house with the well-kept compound full of flowering plants Mom had spent years nurturing. It felt lived in rather than luxurious, comfortable, warm, full of memories. Framed family photographs lined the walls, and around our dining table, a sixth chair always sat neatly in place, though only 5 of us ever used it. People used to ask me what growing up in the Adebayo family was like. I never knew how to answer. How do you explain the feeling of being loved so consistently that it becomes ordinary? My father was an architect, not the kind whose face appeared in newspapers, just the kind whose buildings quietly became part of people's lives. Schools, hospitals, office complexes, places that mattered. Mom taught literature at a private secondary school before retiring. She believed stories could change people. Dad believed buildings could. Somehow, they both ended up raising a journalist. Femi always said I inherited the worst parts of both of them. I build stories, I tell him, and destroy everybody's peace while I do it. Exactly, he'd say. He wasn't wrong. If you're entering this house, wash your hands first, Mom shouted. I've not even entered. I'm preparing in advance. I laughed as I stepped inside. Everything smelled like home. Not perfume, not expensive candles. Home smelled like onions frying, seasoning cubes dissolving in hot stew, and my mother's voice floating from one room to another. I dropped my bag and walked into the kitchen. She turned around, froze, and her eyes landed on the ring. One hand flew to her mouth, tears filling her eyes before she said another word. "You said yes." I said yes. She pulled me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. "My baby, I've been waiting for this day." "I know. I've been pretending not to know." "I know." She held my face. "He did well." I looked at the ring. He really did. From behind us came Femi's voice. "So, can I finally call Steve my brother?" "You've been calling him that already." "Practice," he grinned. I wanted to be ready. Dad walked into the kitchen just then, wiping his glasses with a small handkerchief. He turned 60 that morning, but apart from a little more grey at his temples, he still looked exactly like the man I had always known. Calm, gentle, the kind of man who listened before he spoke. He looked at my face, then my hand. His eyes settled on the ring. For a moment he said nothing. Then he smiled, a slow, quiet smile that reached his eyes. "So," he finally asked. I walked over and hugged him. He did. He wrapped his arms around me. "I'm happy for you." His voice was steady, but I felt him hold me just a little longer than usual. When he finally let go, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small black voice recorder. Pressed a button, a tiny red light blinked. Mom sighed. "Gabriel." "What?" "You've started again." "I don't want to forget." "You've been saying that for years." He smiled sheepishly. "I know, but I like keeping memories." He looked at me. "Today's worth keeping." He spoke into the recorder. "Saturday, my daughter got engaged today. I've never seen her smile this much." Click. I laughed. "You really record everything." "Not everything," he shrugged. "Almost everything." He glanced towards Mom. "Some memories deserve a second chance." At the time, I thought he was simply becoming sentimental with age. Looking back, I realized my father had been trying to outrun forgetting long before any of us noticed.
By late afternoon, the house no longer belonged to us. It belonged to relatives, neighbors, church members, old colleagues, family friends. Laughter bounced from room to room. Children chased each other around the compound, while adults argued over football, politics, and whose jollof recipe deserved national recognition. Dad moved from group to group, greeting everyone with the same warmth he always did. He wasn't the loudest person in the room. He never needed to be. People naturally gravitated towards him. Respect has a quiet way of announcing itself. Steve arrived just before sunset, looking unusually nervous for a man who had already proposed. Dad spotted him first. "There he is." Steve greeted everyone before finally reaching me. "You look beautiful." "I do." He laughed. "I don't think that's how compliments work." "It is today." I laughed back. Our fingers found each other naturally. No performance, no audience, just habit. Timmy appeared beside us, carrying a plate overloaded with small chops. "I leave you two alone for 5 minutes and you're already looking at each other like a Nollywood poster." Steve laughed. "Did you find food already?" "I found purpose," she retorted. Femi walked past without breaking stride and stole a spring roll. Timmy gasped. "You thief!" "Where's your evidence?" He laughed. She turned to Steve. "Please tell me this family is not always like this." He looked around the room, then smiled. "I hope they are." She looked at him for a second, then quietly said, "You have no idea how lucky you are." She smiled immediately after, but I knew that smile. It was the one she wore whenever she remembered what she'd never really had. I slipped my hand into hers. "You belong here too." She bumped my shoulder playfully. "I know. I'm still collecting my own invitation to permanent adoption." We laughed, and the conversation moved on. None of us noticed Dad watching us from across the room, smiling, one hand resting unconsciously against the recorder in his pocket. As evening settled over the house, Mom clinked a spoon against a glass. The room slowly fell quiet. Dad looked around, confused. What happened? "You've spent your entire life celebrating everyone else." Mom smiled. "I think it's finally your turn." The applause erupted through the room. Dad rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. I don't know what to say. You'll think of something. I usually do. Laughter rippled through the room. Then Mom turned to Steve. I believe you had something else planned? Every head turned. Steve looked at me, then at Dad. Dad gave him a small nod. Steve took a slow breath and walked towards me. You people planned another surprise? I whispered. Femi grinned. Maybe. Every single person in the room was smiling, except me, because I was completely confused. Steve reached into his pocket, not for the ring, I was already wearing it, but for a second, smaller box. Inside was a simple gold pendant with a tiny engraved compass. He handed it to me. I couldn't give you this the other day. My dad gave it to me, he said softly. He always said a compass isn't useful because it tells you where to go. It's useful because it reminds you where north is, even when you are lost. I want this to remind you that no matter where life takes us, you'll never have to find your way alone. I felt tears gathering again. He took my hand, not dramatically, not nervously, just with certainty. I asked you to marry me on Thursday, but I'd like to ask your family something today. He turned to Mom and Dad. I know marriage isn't just about two people. It's about families choosing each other too. Thank you for raising the woman I love. The room fell completely silent. Dad's eyes glistened. He stood, walked slowly to Steve and pulled him into a hug. No speeches, no applause. Just one father silently welcoming another son. When they stepped apart, Dad rested a hand on Steve's shoulder. Take care of her. I will. I know. Those two words carried a weight I wouldn't understand until much later. Because my father wasn't only asking Steve to protect me. Somewhere deep inside, he was already wondering who would protect me from the truth. The night ended with photographs. Far too many photographs. Dad insisted on taking one more after everyone said they were finished. One more. Dad, we've taken 20, so 21 won't hurt. He handed his phone to a neighbor. As everyone squeezed together, Dad looked around, then frowned. Wait. He glanced towards the dining room. Bring one more chair. Femi laughed. Dad, there's no space. There will be. We don't need another chair. Dad smiled absent-mindedly. I know, I just don't like empty spaces. Nobody questioned it. Femi dragged the extra dining chair outside and placed it at the edge of the group. It looked unnecessary, almost strange. We took the photograph, smiling, laughing, completely unaware that one empty chair had quietly told the truth long before any of us were ready to hear it. The next morning, my father forgot his way home, and everything we thought we knew about our family began to unravel.
It was Sunday evening. The birthday decorations still hung where they'd been left the night before. Deflated balloons rested in one corner. Half-empty gift bags sat neatly against the wall. The house still carried traces of celebration, but an uneasy silence had replaced the laughter. People always imagine life-changing moments as loud, a crash, a scream, a phone call in the middle of the night. Mine arrived quietly. It looked like an ordinary Sunday, until it wasn't. By the time I got home, Mom was sitting on the edge of the sofa, both hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she'd long stopped drinking. She looked up the moment I entered. Her eyes were swollen, not from crying, but from trying not to. I rushed to her. Where's Dad? She pointed towards the bedroom. The doctor gave him something to help him rest. What happened? I asked, panicking. She inhaled slowly. He went for his evening walk. I nodded. He called me 20 minutes later. Her voice cracked. He asked me for directions home. I stared at her, genuinely unable to process the sentence. She continued quietly. The neighbors found him standing 3 streets away. He recognized faces, but not places. He knew who I was. He knew Femi. He knew you. He just swallowed. Didn't know where he belonged. The room became painfully still. The doctor arrived shortly after. He'd known my parents for years.
He examined Dad carefully and asked simple questions: the date, his age, the president, his birthday. Dad answered everyone correctly. Then he held up his car keys. "Who do these belong to?" "They're mine." "Good. And where's your house?" Dad smiled politely. Then his smile faded. He looked around the room, then at Mom. "I know this is my house," he said, rubbing his forehead. "I just couldn't find it." The room became painfully still. The doctor nodded assuredly. It could be stress. It could be exhaustion. It could be one isolated episode. He packed away his stethoscope. "But I'd like us to run some tests tomorrow." That night, nobody slept properly. Mom checked on Dad every hour. Femi pretended to watch television. I sat on the back veranda long after midnight. Steve found me there. He hadn't gone home. He simply walked outside and sat beside me. Neither of us spoke for a while. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was tired. Finally, I asked, "Have you ever been scared of losing someone while they're still here?" He looked ahead. "My grandmother had dementia." He smiled faintly. "At first, she forgot birthdays. Then she started calling me by my father's name. The hardest day wasn't when she forgot me. It was when she remembered just enough to realize she had forgotten. I'm scared," I admitted. "I've never seen him like that." Steve reached for my hand. "He'll need all of you now." "What if this gets worse?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he squeezed my hand gently. "Then we'll face worse." "Not you. Will." It was such a small word, but it made all the difference.
Monday morning arrived with hospital corridors, long waiting times, and conversations nobody wanted to have. Dad hated hospitals, not because he was afraid, but because he was impatient. He kept saying, "I feel fine." He looked around the waiting room. "We're wasting everybody's time." Mom smiled. "I'd rather waste today than regret tomorrow." He couldn't argue with that. After several hours of scans, blood tests, and cognitive assessments, the neurologist finally called us into his office. He was calm, measured, the kind of doctor who understood that sometimes people listen more to his face than his words. He folded his hands on the desk. "There are some changes we'd like to monitor." Mom's immediate fingers found Dad's hand. "What kind of changes?" "We're seeing some signs of early cognitive decline." The words hung in the room. Heavy. Unwelcome. Dad was the first to speak. "So, my brain is getting old before the rest of me?" The doctor smiled gently. "Something like that. We're not making any final diagnosis today, but I'd like us to begin monitoring him closely. There are medications that may help slow progression if this turns out to be what we're concerned about." He paused. "One episode doesn't define a future, but we should not ignore it either." On the drive home, Dad insisted on sitting in the passenger seat. "I think your mother deserves a turn," he smiled. Mom forced herself to smile back. But I noticed something. Dad quietly placed his car keys inside the glove box, then closed it, almost as if he had made a decision. He never drove himself again. Over the following weeks, life tried very hard to pretend nothing had changed. Dad still visited his architectural firm. He still watered Mom's flowers every evening. He still argued with Femi about football. He still reminded me to eat proper food. He still recorded voice notes, only now, more of them. Sometimes I'd walk past his study and hear his voice. "Remember to call the electrician." Click. "The mango tree needs pruning." Click. "Buy more batteries." Click. Tiny moments, ordinary moments, almost obsessive moments. One afternoon I teased him. "Dad, are you planning to write an autobiography with those recordings?" He laughed. "My memory has started negotiating with me, so I'm negotiating back." Neither of us realized any, but those little recordings were becoming a map he hoped he'd never need. A month later, everything changed again. This time it started with Mom. She collapsed in the kitchen. She simply reached for the counter, missed it, and slowly sank to the floor.
When we got her to the hospital, the doctors quickly assured us it wasn't life-threatening. Severe anemia, treatable. She needed a blood transfusion before surgery for an unrelated condition she'd been postponing. Routine. Nothing to panic about. Or so we thought. The nurse looked up from the file. We'll need one of the children to donate if possible. Femi stood first. I'll do it. I stood too. We'll both test. The nurse smiled. Good, it makes things easier. I had no idea those simple blood tests were about to uncover the one thing my family had unknowingly buried for 24 years. The nurses moved briskly from ward to ward while anxious families waited on rows of plastic chairs, clinging to hope and routine. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Hospitals have their own language. Machines beep, shoes squeak against polished floors. People lower their voices without being asked. Even hope sounds quieter there. The nurse returned with 2 envelopes, one for Femi, one for me. Dr. Adebayo will see you both. Femi nudged me. Relax. I am relaxed. No, you're pretending. I've watched enough medical dramas. Exactly why you're pretending. We smiled at each other. The kind of smile siblings develop after years of finishing arguments they no longer remember starting. The doctor greeted us warmly and opened Femi's file first. Everything looked normal. Then he picked up mine. His smile disappeared, not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. He looked at the report again, then back at me, then at Femi. I'm sorry, I'd like to ask a few questions. Are you and Mr. Femi Adebayo biological siblings? Femi frowned. Yes. He looked at me. And your parents are Gabriel and Bisi Adebayo? Yes. He nodded slowly, looking back at the file. I'm asking because your blood group and inherited markers present an unusual combination. It could mean nothing, but I'd like to repeat your test. Sometimes laboratories make mistakes. 2 hours later, the second test produced exactly the same result. The doctor requested a third, not because he doubted the science, but because he understood what science sometimes does to families. By evening, Mom had received her transfusion and was recovering well. Dad sat beside her bed reading aloud from a newspaper she'd already fallen asleep listening to. It was such an ordinary picture. I remember thinking, whatever this doctor wants to say, it cannot possibly matter more than this. The next morning, the doctor requested a private meeting. Only me. Mom was resting. Dad had gone downstairs for tea. Femi sat beside me as we entered the consultation room. The doctor closed the door, stood beside the window for a moment, almost gathering courage, then turned. I've repeated the test 3 times. Nobody spoke. There appears to be a biological inconsistency. I frowned. What does that mean? He looked directly at me. Based on these results, it is extremely unlikely that both Gabriel and Bisi Adebayo are your biological parents. The room disappeared. Not literally, just everything became distant, as though someone had lowered the volume of the world. I blinked. I'm sorry, I don't understand. The doctor slid the report across the desk. There are genetic markers that should be present if they were both your biological parents. They aren't. Femi immediately shook his head. No, the tests are wrong. They've never been wrong before. They are now. The doctor remained calm. I'm not asking you to believe this today. I'm simply telling you what these results show. Femi stood. My parents have raised her for 27 years. I understand. My sister is my sister. I understand. You don't, his voice cracked. You don't. He grabbed my hand. We're leaving. I hadn't moved. Couldn't. My eyes stayed fixed on the reports. My name, my blood group, my parents' names. Everything looked ordinary, except one sentence. Biological relationship inconsistent with parentage. I read it again and again, as though enough reading would make the words rearrange themselves into something kinder. We didn't tell Mom. We didn't tell Dad. Not that day. The doctor suggested a confirmatory DNA test, more comprehensive, one that would remove every possible doubt. Femi answered before I could. Fine. When? As soon as possible. The drive home was silent. I watched people crossing roads, buying fruit, arguing over transport fares, living completely normal lives. I envied every single one of them. That evening, Steve came over. He knew immediately something was wrong. You've been crying. I haven't. Tomi, I said I haven't. He didn't argue, he simply waited. Eventually, I handed him the hospital report. He read it once, then a second time, then looked at me. This doesn't change who you are. It changes everything. It changes biology. It changes my life. No, it changes information. I laughed bitterly. That's a very journalist way of saying my parents might not actually be my parents. He sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, but not so close that I felt crowded. I don't know what this means yet, neither do you, so let's not decide the ending before we've read the middle. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But doubt has a way of entering through the smallest crack. Once inside, it quietly starts questioning everything. The DNA test was scheduled for Friday, 4 days away. 4 days suddenly felt like 4 years. I found myself studying old family photographs, not because I expected answers, but because I wanted reassurance. Dad teaching me to ride a bicycle, Mom braiding my hair before school, Christmas mornings, birthdays, graduations. Every photograph whispered the same thing. This is your family. Yet for the first time, my mind whispered back, what if it isn't? That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, I walked quietly to the kitchen for water. As I passed Dad's study, I noticed a thin strip of light beneath the door. He was awake. I knocked gently. He was sitting alone at his desk, the recorder beside him, its tiny red light blinking. He quickly pressed stop. I didn't know you were awake. I could say the same. He smiled. I've always done my best thinking at night.
I nodded, my eyes wandering around the room. Architectural sketches, old photographs, neatly labeled storage boxes. And on the bookshelf, a small wooden box I'd never seen before. Before I could ask about it, Dad quietly slid it further behind a stack of books. So, he smiled, have you finally started eating proper meals? We're changing the subject, I asked. We're changing the subject, he said, smiling. Neither of us realized it then, but both of us were already keeping secrets. His had just arrived. His had been waiting for years. Friday morning found Steve and I at a private diagnostic laboratory, its glass walls clean, its white floors polished to a shine. Outside, the city moved as though nothing extraordinary was happening. Inside, time felt painfully slow. There are some days you spend praying for the phone not to ring. This wasn't one of them. I wanted it to ring. I wanted certainty, even if it hurt. Uncertainty was beginning to hurt more. The DNA samples had been taken 2 days earlier. Mine, Dad's, Mom's. The laboratory had promised expedited results because of Mom's ongoing treatment. I had replayed every possible outcome in my head. The tests were wrong, the doctor mixed up the files, some technical explanation none of us understood. Anything except the possibility that the people who had spent 27 years loving me were not the people who brought me into the world. Steve insisted on driving. You shouldn't be alone. I'll be fine. I know I'm still coming. There was no point arguing. I had learned that about him early in our relationship. When he made up his mind about showing up, he showed up. Femi arrived just before our names were called, looking exhausted. When did you sleep? I didn't. You should have. I wasn't in the mood. Neither was I. The genetic counselor welcomed us into her office. She was probably in her late 50s with calm eyes and a gentle voice. The kind of person who had delivered difficult news often enough to know that no amount of experience ever made it easy. She placed 3 sealed envelopes on the table. I reviewed the reports personally. Nobody reached for the envelopes. Nobody wanted to be the first. She finally spoke. The previous findings have been confirmed.
I felt my heartbeat in my throat. The DNA results show that Gabriel Adebayo is not your biological father. Silence. And Bisi Adebayo is also not your biological mother. The room dissolved again, not because I fainted, because my mind refused to stay inside it. I stared at the table, at the envelopes, at my own hands. They looked familiar. Nothing else did. Femi pushed his chair back so suddenly it scraped loudly across the floor. No, this is impossible. I'm sorry, she said calmly but apologetically. My father taught her to walk. My mother stayed awake every night whenever she was sick. They're her parents. They raised her. Yes, they are her parents. They may not be her biological parents. The distinction landed like a stone, heavy enough to sink everything. I don't remember leaving the office. I remember standing outside, the afternoon sun bright enough to hurt my eyes. People walked past carrying shopping bags and takeaway food. Someone laughed. A bus conductor shouted for passengers. Life had not stopped. Mine had. I finally spoke. So, what happens now? My voice sounded unfamiliar. Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Steve quietly took the envelope from my hand. Do you want me to read it? I shook my head. No. I opened it myself. Every line felt colder than the one before it. Then near the bottom, one sentence. Probability of biological parentage, 0%. I folded the papers carefully, almost respectfully, as though neatness could somehow reduce the pain. The drive back felt longer than usual. Halfway home, Femi suddenly asked Steve to stop the car. He stepped out, walked a few meters away, then punched a concrete wall so hard his knuckles immediately began to bleed. I ran after him. Femi? He pulled away. No, don't. He turned to me, his eyes filled with tears he'd been refusing to shed. They are wrong. I know. They have to be. I know. They are lying. I know. I stepped forward and hugged him. He laughed once, a broken laugh, then finally cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet crying of a man watching the foundations of his life begin to shift. He looked at me through blurred eyes. You are my sister. I know, I responded quickly with a voice I didn't recognize. I don't care what any paper says, he said again, almost reassuring himself. I know, I replied, drawing strength from him. I'm serious, he said again, almost immediately. I know, I replied, almost like a zombie. I'll keep saying it until you believe me, he pushed again. This time, I couldn't respond. My tears didn't let me. I was still hugging him really tightly, and for several seconds, neither of us let go.
That evening, we sat in Mom's hospital room, pretending everything was normal. Dad told one of his terrible jokes. Mom rolled her eyes before he reached the punchline. Steve laughed anyway. Femi forced a smile. I tried, failed, then looked around the room. How could 4 people feel so familiar and suddenly so impossible? Dad noticed me watching. Are you all right? I smiled automatically. I'm fine. He looked at me a second longer than usual, almost as if he wanted to ask another question. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the recorder and pressed record. Friday, the children came to visit. I am grateful. Click. I watched him slip it back into his pocket. For the first time, that recorder no longer looked like a harmless habit. It looked like something waiting. 3 days later, Mom was discharged. Life tried once again to return to normal. It couldn't. The DNA report sat inside my wardrobe, hidden beneath neatly folded clothes. I told myself I wasn't ready. Ready for what? I didn't know. Because asking the question meant accepting there was a question to ask. The answer found us anyway. It happened on a Wednesday evening. Dad forgot my birthday. Not the date, the memory. He looked at an old family album and smiled. You are such a beautiful little girl. I still am. You are? He nodded, then frowned. I wish I could remember this day. You are there. I know. He tapped the side of his head. Can't reach it. That frightened me more than the first time he forgot his way home. Because this wasn't a place.
It was me. That night, Mom called. Her voice was unusually quiet. "Tommy, can you come tomorrow evening?" "Of course. It's important." "What happened?" She hesitated, then answered with only 6 words. "Your father wants to tell you something." My heart sank. Somehow, before she said another word, I knew. Whatever my father was about to tell me, he had been carrying it alone for a very long time. The rain had just begun the following evening, arriving quietly the way it does in Ibadan when no one has been watching the sky. I drove to the house in a silence that had nothing to do with sound. The radio was off, the windows were up, the city moved around me the way it always did, indifferent, loud, completely unbothered by the fact that I had spent the last day rehearsing a version of myself that could sit across from my parents and hold a conversation without everything inside me showing. I hadn't told Mom about the DNA results. Neither had Femi. We'd agreed on that without really discussing it, the way you agree on something when you both already know the answer and are too exhausted to say it aloud. But whatever Dad wanted to see, he had asked us to hear it together. That alone told me what I already suspected. He knew. He had always known. Rain had begun by the time I parked. Not heavy, just the kind that settles in before a storm decides what it wants to be. I sat in the car a moment longer than necessary, watching it collect on the windscreen in slow, patient lines. The porch light was on. It was always on when someone was expected. Femi was already there, standing near the window, arms folded. He glanced at me and gave a small nod that said everything without saying anything. Mom sat on the sofa, her posture careful, the way it gets when she's managing something she doesn't want her face to show. She reached for my hand before I'd even fully sat down, held it for a second, then let go. Dad was in his study. I could hear him moving, the slow, deliberate kind of moving that belongs to someone who is not looking for anything, but isn't quite ready to stop looking either. Nobody spoke for a while. The rain grew a little heavier against the window. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. The same clock that had always been there, on the same wall, marking time the way it always had. But that evening, it sounded different. Not faster, just more present. As though even it understood something was about to happen that could not be undone. Dad walked in carrying the small wooden box, the same one I'd noticed on his bookshelf days earlier, the one he'd quickly hidden when I caught him looking. He set it down on the center table without explaining it, then sat, slowly, like a man lowering himself into something cold. He looked at Mom first. She gave him one small nod, the kind that doesn't mean yes, but means I am here. Go ahead. Then he looked at me and at Femi. His voice, when it came, was quiet. Not broken, not yet. Just quiet in the way that tells you a person has been practicing a moment for a very long time, only now discovering practice changes nothing about what it costs to actually say it. "There is something I should have told you a long time ago," he said. He paused, his hands resting on the wooden box, but not opening it, not yet. "I have been afraid to tell you for a very long time, and I've been even more afraid that one day my memory would take it with it before I found the courage to say it." Femi shifted slightly beside me. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on Dad. "It began with an accident," he said. 24 years ago, on the highway outside Abuja. I knew something was coming. I had felt it since Mom's phone call, maybe even before, since the DNA report, since the recorder blinking in the dark of his study, since the empty chair that appeared in too many photographs for too many years. But knowing something is coming does not prepare you for the moment it arrives. It only means you are awake when it does. He described it slowly at first, the journey to Abuja, a conference, the plan to return the following morning. A family in the other car, a father and his little girl, making the same trip in the same direction. The collision, the chaos afterwards, the hospitals that received patients from the scene and did not always know what they were receiving. He described finding me in the hospital, 3 years old, injured, unconscious, dressed in yellow. And around one small wrist was the blue ribbon that Mom had tied into my hair that same morning, helping me get ready to go. The ribbon that she recognized. The ribbon that told them without question that the little girl in that hospital bed was theirs. Except she was not. The room had gone very still. Outside, the rain continued, the clock continued, everything continued except us. Mom had her face turned slightly to the side, not away, just slightly, as though she could bear the words better at an angle. Femi had not moved. He was very still, in the way that means a person is holding himself together with considerable effort and would prefer not to be tested. I could not speak. I was not sure there was anything to say that would shatter whatever fragile air remained in that room. So I just sat there, listening, letting 24 years of silence finally take up the space it had always deserved. I stared at my father. No, at the man I had called my father for 27 years. I wanted to interrupt him, to ask 100 questions, but somehow I knew if I did, he might never find the strength to continue. He rubbed both palms together before speaking again. "We thought we'd found our daughter," he said, his voice trembling. "We never questioned it. The doctors told us the facial injuries were severe. They warned us that surgery would change some of her features. They warned us that trauma could affect her speech. They told us that recovery would take time." He smiled painfully. "So, when you barely spoke, we thought you were healing. When you became frightened around loud noises, we thought you were healing. When you woke up crying every night, we thought you were healing." He looked down. "We never imagined you were grieving a family you couldn't remember." I could barely breathe. "So, you really believed I was your daughter?" He looked at me immediately, every single day, without question, without hesitation. His answer came so quickly that I knew it was true. "We stayed in the hospital for almost 10 months. You underwent several surgeries, speech therapy, physiotherapy, counseling. The doctors kept telling us that memory after severe childhood trauma could return slowly or never. So when you didn't recognize familiar places, we accepted it. When you had to learn things all over again, we celebrated every tiny victory." His eyes filled with tears. "We weren't pretending you were my daughter. We believed you were." Mom finally found her voice. "I used to sit beside your hospital bed every evening. I'd pray over you, read storybooks, sing the same lullaby over and over. I kept praying, 'Lord, thank you for sparing my little girl.' I had no idea another mother wasn't there to pray for you." The room became unbearably quiet. One question had been growing inside me since Dad started talking. I couldn't hold it back any longer. My parents, my real parents, what happened to them? Dad closed his eyes. For a long moment, he couldn't answer. Finally, he spoke. "Daniel died at the scene." The words landed heavily. My throat tightened. "And my mother?" Dad looked at Mom, then back at me. "Daniel had lost his wife 3 years earlier. Her name was Amara. She died shortly after giving birth to you." I stared at him. He nodded slowly. "You were all he had." I felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath me. My entire family was gone? Dad's eyes filled. "As far as we knew, yes." He leaned slowly and pushed the wooden box closer to me. He said, "I've opened this box 1,000 times and closed it 1,000 more. Inside were newspaper clippings, hospital documents, photographs, letters, and an old blue ribbon, perfectly preserved." My hands froze. The ribbon, the same ribbon Mom had spoken about, the same ribbon that had changed everything. Beneath the ribbon lay 2 tiny photographs. One showed Dad holding a laughing little girl on his shoulders. The other, a man I'd never seen before, standing beside a little girl with bright, curious eyes, pointing excitedly at something outside the frame. Her father wasn't looking at whatever it was. He was looking at her, the way fathers do, as though nothing else mattered. I couldn't take my eyes off the photograph. "That's Dad?" I stopped myself. "No, not Dad. Daniel." He quietly nodded. "Daniel Afolanyo." I reached out with trembling fingers. The photograph felt impossibly ordinary. A father, his daughter, a moment nobody expected to become the last photograph they'd ever take together. "What about his family?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "We searched for years. I hired investigators. I contacted the police, the hospitals, the Federal Road Safety Corps, the Architectural Association, anyone who might know something. He reached into the box again, pulling out a thick bundle of letters. Every envelope had been opened. Some stamped returned to our sender, others simply read address unknown. He had one younger sister, Esther, who had relocated to Canada years earlier. They weren't speaking. The family disagreed with Daniel marrying Amara, and they blamed him after she died. They drifted apart. Nobody knew where she was. Nobody could reach her. The addresses we found were all old. The phone numbers no longer existed. I kept searching. Every year, I never stopped. I looked at him. Why didn't you tell me? His shoulders slumped. Because there was nothing to tell. I wasn't hiding another family. I was searching for one. That sentence broke something inside me. Not because it answered everything, because it made his silence feel heavier. You searched for 24 years? He nodded. I closed the box very gently, then asked the question that had been waiting since the beginning. So, when did you know? He looked away, not because he didn't want to answer, but because remembering hurt. 3 years after the accident, he whispered. It started with a routine medical examination. I had taken you for a follow-up appointment. You were almost 6. The surgeons wanted to monitor the reconstruction on your cheek. I instinctively touched the faint scar curving beneath my left cheekbone, one I'd had for as long as I can remember and had never questioned. They needed blood work, he continued. The doctor frowned, asked whether there had been a mistake. I laughed. I told him there could possibly be no one. He smiled bitterly. I wish I hadn't laughed. The tests didn't make sense. They repeated them. Then they quietly suggested something I refused to believe. He looked directly at me. They asked for a DNA test. I could feel anger rising in his voice as he continued speaking. I remember being angry. I thought they were insulting my family. I argued with them. I demanded another lab, another specialist, another opinion. He shook his head slowly. They all reached the same conclusion. I wasn't your biological father. Mom began to cry again, quietly, the way people cry after running out of tears hours earlier. I refused to accept it, Dad continued. I thought there had to be another explanation, so I traveled back to Abuja. I requested every accident report, every hospital file, every transfer record, every police document. It took months. His breathing steadied. Then I found it. A missing page, a corrected admission record, a handwritten note. He closed his eyes. The wrong child had been matched to the wrong family. Nobody spoke because there was nothing left to interrupt. The truth had finally found its voice. Dad looked at me for a long time, not waiting for forgiveness, simply making sure I was still there. He said, I came home that evening and your mother knew immediately. Mom nodded quietly before saying, I'd never seen him look like that before. He didn't even remove his shoes. He just sat on the floor. She looked down at her hands before adding, and he cried like a baby. Dad smiled weakly. I told her everything. The DNA, the paperwork, the accident, the missing hospital records, the possibility, he struggled over the words, that we'd been raising another man's daughter. What did you do? I asked. The only thing I could. I searched. His voice steadied. Every annual leave, every free weekend, every conference that brought me anywhere near Abuja, I searched. Orphanage records, immigration records, school records, church records. I hired 2 different investigators over the years. I spoke to people who had worked at the hospital. I met retired police officers. I even tracked down one of the nurses who'd been on duty that night. He smiled sadly. She still blamed herself. Did anyone ever find... I couldn't finish the question. My daughter? He said quietly. He nodded slowly. No, they never found her. The room became impossibly quiet. I don't know whether she died before reaching another hospital, he continued, his voice cracking. I don't know whether another family buried her. I don't know whether she survived somewhere else. I've lived with all 3 possibilities every single day. For the first time since he'd begun speaking, Dad broke. Not loudly, his shoulders simply collapsed. I buried my little girl once, when I thought she'd died. He looked directly at me. And I buried her again when I realized she'd never been the child I'd been raising. No one in the room moved. Even breathing felt like an interruption. I wanted to tell you, he whispered, so many times, when you turned 18, when you graduated, when you got your first job, when Steve came to ask for your hand. I planned speeches. I rehearsed them. I recorded them. He looked toward the recorder lying on the center table. But every time I looked at you, I became your father again. His voice broke completely. Selfishly, I couldn't bear the thought of losing you too. I couldn't stop the tears anymore. So you chose to lie? He shook his head immediately. No, I chose fear. I kept telling myself, just one more year, just until she's happier, just until she's stronger, just until I find someone from her family. Then another year passed, and another and another. Mom quietly reached for my hand. I wanted to tell you, she said, crying so hard every sentence came apart halfway through. I begged him. Then I'd look at you and I'd become your mother again. She closed her eyes. I'm sorry, so sorry. Nobody spoke, not because there was nothing to say, because some pain deserves silence before words. After what felt like forever, Femi finally spoke, his voice low, almost trembling. Did you ever love her differently after you found out? Did you ever look at her and stop seeing your daughter? Dad looked horrified. The answer came before the question had fully settled. Never. Not for 1 second. His voice was firm now, the firmest it had been all night. I challenged the DNA. I questioned the hospitals. I questioned God. I questioned myself. But I never, he looked straight at me, never questioned being your father. He stood slowly and walked over to me, then knelt, not because he was weak, but because he wanted to look me in the eyes. I did not change your nappies because of shared DNA. I didn't teach you to ride a bicycle because of genetics. I didn't stay awake through your fevers because a laboratory told me to. I did those things because you were my daughter. And somewhere along the line, biology stopped mattering. I broke. Everything I'd been holding together since the hospital finally gave way. I cried, not gracefully, not quietly. Years of certainty collapsing inside minutes. I didn't know who I was mourning. Daniel, Amara, a little girl I'd never met, the version of myself that existed an hour ago, or the father kneeling in front of me, afraid that after 27 years I might stop calling him Dad. Without thinking, I threw my arms around him. He froze for just a second, then held me as though he was afraid I might disappear. He whispered, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I know, I know. Across the room, Mom finally cried openly into Femi's shoulder. Steve quietly looked away, giving us the privacy of pretending he hadn't witnessed the most painful moment our family had ever lived through. When the crying eventually settled, Dad remembered something. He said, there is one more thing. He walked back to the wooden box, reached under the old documents, and carefully unfolded a yellowed sheet of paper. He handed it to me. It was an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, Architect killed in highway tragedy, daughter still missing. Beneath it, a small photograph of Daniel, the same one I'd seen moments earlier, and beside him, a grainy picture of 3-year-old me, not Tomi Adebayo, Tomi Afolayan. My hair was shorter, my smile wider, and tied loosely around one tiny ponytail was a blue ribbon. For the first time in my life, I was looking at myself as someone else's daughter, and somehow that hurt almost as much as losing her all over again. The rain had stopped completely. The celebration banners from Dad's birthday still hung above the dining area, a cruel reminder that joy and grief can exist in the same room. Nobody left, not because there was more to say, because none of us knew how to leave that room as different people than the ones who had walked into it. Steve quietly made tea for everyone. No one asked him to do. He simply noticed the cups had gone cold. That was who he was. He looked for small things he could fix when the big things couldn't be fixed. I sat alone staring at the old newspaper clipping. 27 years. 27 years, and somewhere in this country, there had once been another little girl, one who had laughed like me, cried like me, held her father's hand on the way to Abuja,
one who had left home thinking she was coming back. I found myself whispering, "I'm sorry." I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to. Daniel, my mother Amara, Gabriel, the little girl who never made it home, or the version of me that no longer existed. Steve walked over quietly. He didn't sit immediately. "Can I?" I nodded. He lowered himself beside me. For a while, he simply looked at the newspaper in my hands, then asked softly, "What are you thinking?" I laughed once. It sounded empty. "I don't even know who I am anymore." The words escaped before I could stop them. I looked at him, tears gathering again. "I'm sure by now you're already rethinking marrying me." He frowned. I continued before he could interrupt. "You probably don't even know who I am. I'm not even sure I know who I am." For the first time since I'd known him, Steve didn't immediately comfort me. He looked straight into my eyes and didn't look away, didn't soften the moment. His voice was calm, almost firm. "Well, that's where you are wrong." He leaned forward slightly. "You're the woman who survives on Coca-Cola and Fab biscuit for an entire day because she's chasing one more source for a story. You are the journalist who refuses to publish anything she can't verify. The woman who cries over documentaries. The woman who secretly pays school fees for people and tells nobody. The woman who calls her mother every Sunday afternoon even when she's busy. The woman who keeps 37 open tabs because she's convinced she'll read them later." A tiny laugh escaped me through the tears. He smiled. "That's the woman I fell in love with, and she hasn't changed, not one bit." The tears came harder, not because he'd solved anything, but because he hadn't tried to. He had simply reminded me that my identity wasn't disappearing as quickly as I feared. He rested his forehead gently against mine. "I don't know who gave you life," he whispered, "but I know who's lived it. I've watched her. I've loved her. And that's enough for me." Across the room, Dad had heard every word. He quietly lowered his head. For the first time that evening, I saw relief on his face. Not because everything was okay, because he realized I wasn't completely alone. Much later that night, after Steve had gone home and Femi had finally convinced Mom to get some sleep, Dad asked if we could sit outside. The compound was cool after the rain, the scent of wet earth drifting through the air. For years, this had been where we had our best conversations. Neither of us realized it might become our most important one. Dad looked up at the night sky. "When you were little, you hated thunderstorms. I remember. You'd run into our room. You always said thunder sounded angry." I smiled faintly. "You used to count between the lightning and the thunder, so I'd know how far away it was." He laughed softly. "I'd forgotten that." Then he looked at me. "No," he corrected himself. "I remembered because you reminded me." There was something heartbreaking about watching a man celebrate remembering something. After a long silence, he spoke again. "I've been afraid." "I know." "No," he shook his head. "Not of dying. I've lived a good life. I've been afraid that one day I'd forget you before I told you." My chest tightened. I started recording those voice notes because I noticed I was forgetting little things, names, appointments, conversations. I thought if I recorded enough memories, I'd always find my way back. He smiled sadly. "But memories aren't what I was trying to protect." He looked at me. "You were." I reached over and held his hand. It felt older than I remembered, rougher, slightly colder. "Dad," he looked at me. I realized I hadn't hesitated before saying it, not once, not even after everything I'd learnt. His eyes filled immediately. "You still called me Dad." He whispered it more to himself than to me. I squeezed his hand. "I don't know who my biological father was as a person. I know what I've read. I know what you've told me. I know he loved me. And I'll spend the rest of my life honoring that. But the man who taught me honesty, who stayed awake when I had malaria, who taught me to ride a bicycle, who embarrasses me by recording voice notes about buying batteries?" A tear rolled down my cheek. "That's my dad." He covered his face with both hands and cried. Not because he had been forgiven, because the thing he feared losing most had just called him home again. Inside the house, the 6th dining chair remained at the table, empty, quiet, still waiting. Only now I finally understood. It had never been waiting for a missing guest. It had been waiting for the truth. And tonight, the truth had finally taken its seat. I hope you're still enjoying this story. If you were in Tomi's shoes, what would you have done? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more beautiful stories like this one. Now, let's continue. 3 weeks later, the Adebayo house was quieter than it had ever been. Life had resumed on the surface, but every room now carried the awareness that truth had changed the family forever. Outside, the hibiscus flowers Mom had planted years ago bloomed as though nothing had happened. People think healing arrives like a sunrise. One beautiful morning, everything suddenly feels okay. It doesn't. Healing arrives more like learning to walk after an injury. Some days you barely notice the limp. Some days you wonder if you'll ever walk properly again. The first few weeks was strange. I caught myself almost saying, my parents, then stopping. Not because I didn't know who they were, but because now the sentence carried two meanings. Dad's memory continued to drift in small, unpredictable ways. Some mornings he remembered everything. Some afternoons he'd spend 5 minutes looking for the glasses resting on top of his head. Other days he'd stop halfway through a sentence waiting for a word that would refuse to come. He'd laugh about it, we'd laugh with him. But behind every laugh there was fear. Not of today, of tomorrow. One Saturday afternoon, I found him in his study. The recorder sat on the desk, its batteries removed. "You've stopped recording," I said. He looked up. "I have." "Why?" He smiled. "I don't think I need it anymore." I frowned. "But your memory?" He nodded. "My memory may leave," he looked around, "but secrets don't have to stay behind with it." For the first time in years, his study felt lighter, not because the truth had hurt less, but because it no longer had to be hidden. Femi handled everything the way only Femi could. He became louder, funnier, more annoying. He started showing up at my apartment without calling, bringing food I hadn't asked for, pretending he had just happened to be passing. He wasn't fooling anybody. One evening, I asked him, "You know I can survive on my own, right?" He shrugged. "I know." "Then why are you here every other day?" He looked away, then answered quietly, "I don't want you feeling alone long enough to believe you are." That was Femi. He had inherited Dad's heart. He just wore it with more sarcasm. Timmy refused to let me disappear into myself. Every morning she'd send me a ridiculous voice note, sometimes gossip from the newsroom, sometimes complaints about deadlines, sometimes pictures of the terrible food from the office cafeteria. One afternoon, she walked into my office carrying 2 bottles of Coca-Cola. "I've decided." "What?" "If you're going to have an identity crisis, you're not doing it on an empty stomach." I laughed. She smiled triumphantly. "There she is." "Who?" "My best friend, the dramatic one." She sat on the edge of my desk. "You know, when I was little, I used to pray for a family like yours. My parents fought every day. I spent most birthdays wondering which one wouldn't come home." She smiled sadly. "I used to envy you." I lowered my eyes. "I still do," she said. I looked up in surprise. She nodded. "Because after everything, they still chose you." That sentence stayed with me for days.
The story eventually found its way into my work, not because I wrote about it, but because it changed the way I listened to people. Every interview became different. Every headline carried more weight. Every stranger suddenly felt like someone who might be carrying a secret invisible to everyone else. I became slower to judge, quicker to ask questions, kinder with silence. Pain had quietly rewritten the journalist in me. Steve noticed before anyone else. He said, "You've changed." I said, "I know." He smiled and said, "No, you've become softer." I said, "I thought journalists were supposed to become tougher." He replied, "Not the good ones." A month after Dad's confession, I returned to Abuja, alone. Not because I wanted answers, because I wanted to stand where my life had unknowingly divided into 2 different stories. The Civic Center still stood, beautiful, timeless. People walked in and out without knowing what had happened on the highway all those years ago. I found the old road, parked quietly, and stepped out. The traffic was different now.
The road had been expanded, fresh asphalt covered whatever scars had once existed. There was nothing left to see. Yet I stood there for almost an hour, eyes closed, listening. Trying to imagine two little girls laughing in matching yellow dresses, trying to imagine one of them removing a blue ribbon, an act so innocent that it quietly altered 4 families forever. When I got back to Lagos that evening, Dad was waiting on the veranda. He looked at me. Long trip? I smiled. Very. He nodded. Neither of us mentioned where I'd gone. Some journeys explain themselves. He looked at the sunset, then spoke almost absent-mindedly. You know, Daniel would have liked you. I smiled. I hope so. He said, I think he'd have been proud. A lump formed in my throat. So would you. He looked at me as though I had asked the simplest question in the world. Tomi, he smiled, I've been proud of you since long before either of us knew your surname. A few months later, Steve and I got married. It wasn't extravagant, it didn't need to be. Timmy cried before anyone else. Femi claimed dust had entered his eyes. Nobody believed him. Dad remembered every part of the ceremony, every vow, every smile, every dance. At the reception, he even made a speech without looking at a single note. Halfway through it, he forgot one sentence. Everyone held their breath. He laughed, shook his head, then looked directly at me. I've forgotten what I was about to say. The room laughed gently. He smiled. But I haven't forgotten what matters. He raised his glass. My daughter. No one corrected him. No one needed to, because love had already settled the argument long before biology ever started it. Years from now, I know people will ask me where I come from. Some will mean my family. Others will mean my blood. For the first time in my life, I know the answer to both. I was born a daughter of Daniel and Amara Afolayan. I was raised a daughter of Gabriel and Tomi Adebayo. One family gave me life, the other taught me how to live it. And if there's one thing this journey has taught me, it's that family is not built by the people who simply bring you into the world. It's built by the people who choose over and over again to stay when loving you becomes difficult. So, let me ask you something. If the people who loved you most were never the people who shared your blood, would you still call them family? Or does family begin the day someone chooses not to let go? Wow! Thank you for watching until the end. This is my first story, and I am honored you chose to walk with me on this journey. Please subscribe if you enjoyed it. Before you leave, do share with me in the comments, who was your favorite character in this story and why? Have you or someone you know ever experienced something similar? If yes, what was the experience like? And finally, because I am very curious, if you were Tomi, would you have reacted the same way? Please share your thoughts below. Like this video and subscribe for more beautiful stories like this. See you in the next one.